Ben, you're in Rome, right?
I'm in Rome. I'm in Rome, and wonderful to be with you today. Thank you for having me on.
Yes. Okay. Um, Good evening if you're in Asia. It's 2 o'clock in London and 3 o'clock in Rome, where my honorable guest is based. Benedict Phillips is a renowned campaigner, particularly against global inequalities. He's been a long time activist, scholar, writer, and campaigner, worked with Oxfam, ActionAid, and UN, and advised UNDP and other international bodies, as well as national governments. He was also a ANC activist, although he was born and bred in London. That he was involved in anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, and he has very graciously agreed to speak about his book, How to Fight Inequalities, that was put out back in November last year, just a little over 2 months ago, by a very reputable press in UK, Polity Press. Ben, can you explain why inequalities pose such a threat to our human well-being as 7.5 billion people, as well as to the planet itself?
Sure. I think one of the big challenges in the whole conversation about inequality was that a myth was allowed to take hold from about the 1970s until quite recently, that inequality didn't matter. There was a government minister in the UK who famously said he didn't care how filthy rich people got. And people implied that if you were worried about inequality, then you were just jealous or bitter, or you wanted to bring people down rather than lift people up. But we now know the facts. We now know that more unequal societies are more dangerous societies. Just to give one example, you can plot on a graph how unequal is a society on one axis, and on another axis, how many people work as private security guards. The more unequal the country, the more people work as private security guards. The murder rate, the suicide rate, the teenage pregnancy rate, the obesity rate, they all correlate with inequality, even more so than they do with poverty. It also damages democracy. When you have some people with such a vast concentration of wealth, so the top 1%, for example, in Mexico, in India, in Thailand, in Russia, have more than half the wealth. When you have such a situation like that, you don't really have a functioning democracy. So we're not just talking about some people can have more boats, or some people can have more helipads on their boats. We're talking about some people can buy politics, can buy the media, can shape the narrative of what it is we expect. So inequality means a more violent, less livable society. It means a less democratic society. And as you alluded to at the beginning, it also blocks progress on climate change. Climate change is overwhelmingly being driven by the habits of a few. A myth implies that climate change is being driven by, people in Asia getting fridges and ovens. That's not true. Climate change is being driven overwhelmingly by the richest 10%, and within that by the richest 1%. And it is their structural power that gets in the way of fair deals to tackle climate change. When you look, for example, at some of these politicians in America who say that they don't believe in climate change, they do, they know. Donald Trump's golf courses in Scotland were climate change proofed in order that as the waters rose, they wouldn't get flooded. They know. What they block this because it's in their interests to maintain this damaging climate change. So whether you're talking about democracy, whether you're talking about safety, or whether you're talking about climate change, unless we address the inequality crisis, we won't have any of them resolved.
Right. Yeah, but you mentioned, I was reading the review of your book by Sir Richard Jolly, former director of the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex, and former deputy director of, I believe, UNICEF. And but he was extremely positive and welcoming of your book, and he identified, I'm sure you also agree with him as well, the inequalities as one of the three greatest challenges to essentially the survival of a human species. This is no hyperbole, if we look around. So to tackle the crisis, do you think it's understand how inequalities are produced vis-a-vis wealth? We often hear of the billionaire class, the corporate executives, the brilliant business minds creating wealth and putting jobs, on the national economic landscape. But we don't hear about how inequalities have been created, because this level of extreme inequalities, where 1,000 billionaires controlled more than half of the entire wealth of the whole world, 7 billion people, right? Can you explain from your own decades of research into this issue, how inequalities have been produced?
Absolutely. I think the key thing is to remember that ultimately these are human-made. These are constructed. We are ultimately in charge of them. All sorts of language and myths are used to mystify what happens, as if economics is something that happens, somewhere else. It happens in space, or it's some law of physics. It isn't. These are about the decisions that we make as a society. And in particular, they're about who makes them and on what basis. Now, we have a very dominant myth, this idea of the individual heroic billionaire wealth creator. It's not true. It doesn't have an evidential basis. So why is it so persuasive? Why is it so popular? And this goes back to some of the roots of how we've ended up with this powerful forms of inequality. Because one of the things that we need to understand in terms of what drives society is that evidence, facts, don't drive society. Now, progressives like you and me, we want to deal with facts because we don't want to deal with a world in which people just make stuff up. But there's a danger there. There's a danger, and particularly we see it amongst academics, intellectuals, and others, that we personally are so invested in evidence that we lose sight of the fact that the evidence shows that evidence doesn't lead to change. So what does lead to change? Well, one of the factors is an ability to generate myth, to generate narrative, to generate story. And that's why the most successful neoliberal, this is the philosophy that has governed economics for the past 4 decades and has led to such hyper inequality. The most successful neoliberal is not one of their intellectuals like Milton Friedman. No, it's Ronald Reagan, who was a movie star, a propagandist, a president, and then an immensely successful, in their own terms, advocate for this way of thinking. So that idea that they're giving us wealth just is not true, but it's been so successfully inculcated in our heads that makes us look up to them and be ashamed of ourselves and then feel contempt for the poor. Now, there's a wonderful phrase I came across, and it's this. Somebody once said, the tendency to admire or even worship the powerful and the wealthy, and to dismiss or even feel contempt for the poor, is the greatest cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. Now, people think this sounds very radical, communist. Adam Smith said this. Adam Smith, the founder of liberal economics, said this. So we've lived through 4 or 5 decades of a very, very damaging set of myths. And one of them is this idea of the business genius that does it all by themselves. There's never a single case of that happening. And in fact, what's interesting is that if you want an entrepreneurial society, you don't want a society where people fear that if their business goes bankrupt, that they could die for not being able to afford healthcare, that their kids will have no decent school, and that they'll have nowhere safe to walk on the streets. That actually doesn't generate effective entrepreneurship, which is why countries like Finland which have a very, very strong welfare state, which means that when someone lives in fear of, say, if their business doesn't work, it's okay. The kids still have great free school, they still have great free healthcare, they still have a pension, they have unemployment benefit, they have things to fall back on. They actually generate more entrepreneurs per capita. They've had longer and more successful economic growth than, for example, the US. So not only is it not the case that our economy, the wealth for us all, for us as a society, depends on the entrepreneur. It is even the case that the entrepreneur in the end depends on the spread wealth of the whole of society. So there really aren't benefits at all socially to hyper inequality. It's just in the narrow self-interest of a few. And one of the tricks that they've been able to do is to capture this thing around the narrative. So when we look at how do we produce or fight inequality, one of the things that we as academics, policy type people need to realize is it's not just about policy, it's also about stories, it's about ideas. Joe Hill, the great American trade unionist, said that a pamphlet, however brilliant, is only read once and then thrown away, whereas a song is repeated and learned by heart and sung again and again and again. When we look at the successful movements for tackling inequality, we find that story and imagery and art was absolutely at its core. So as we try to build more equal societies, that's one part. Another key part is power. We really need to be serious about power. And here's the most obvious, but the most important fact around power. If you're middle class or working class, in other words, if you're one of the 99%, if you don't have net capital post paying a mortgage and all that thing, if you don't have net capital of above $1 million or $5 million, then I'm talking to you, right? I'm not just talking to people who are struggling right at the bottom. I'm talking about really everybody, really, until you get to that 1% or fraction of a 1% who've got capital beyond 1 million or beyond $5 million and above. We're also looking at trillionaires coming on stream soon. If you're not one of them, you can only be powerful together, never alone. You cannot be powerful as an individual. That's why you need to be part of something. You need to be part of a trade union. You need to be part of a community group, an NGO, whatever it is, you need to be part of it, which is why when we look at countries that are more equal, they usually have high trade union density. That just means people belong to a union. It means they're part of something. They're stronger together. And that's why neoliberals always want to break apart unions. They want to break it apart by telling horrible stories about unions, and they want to break it apart by passing laws and suppressing unions, because the thing that they most fear is that we won't try and just be individuals bargaining with these super powerful, dinosaurs, but that we'll club together. That's their biggest fear, and that's exactly what we need to do, to club together.
Yeah, you were commissioned to write this piece for Writers That Trust, the year 2020 as the year of inequalities, right? And then there was a phrase that you used that captured my mind, and I think you wrote something like, in response to youngsters that you came into contact with through your organizing and educational work, there is no justice, just us. And you said, it is not just us, but just us organized. That is what produces power. And so I've, as an activist myself, I found that I found myself nodding along as I read your piece. And returning to what you mentioned about, the Adam Smith and his attempt to promote the theory of moral sentiment, right? And but he, Glaswegian, he came to live and work in London, and after a while, he returned to Glasgow. On the way, he stopped at Oxford, a number of years, and basically, this was before the 1800, when Adam Smith was studying and writing. At the time, as you know, economics was called a moral philosophy, yes. Right? Now economics been emptied out of any type of moral foundations and all technical stuff, right? And
it's worse than that, because having emptied economics of its moral foundations, they then worked to empty morality from any foundations other than economic. So you even had the horrible example, we talk about another Scottish example, where Margaret Thatcher went to the Church of Scotland and lectured them that the Good Samaritan, that wonderful and beautiful, powerful story about how the hated outsider reaches out for his neighbor and does everything they can. She told these bishops that they'd got it all wrong, and that the Good Samaritan was really a story about how you should save money, because unless you have, you can't help anyone. So not only did they empty economics of any morality, they then sought to empty morality of any morality. We really need both back. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. So what I was going to say is that so Smith picked up on something that has been a perennial crisis or challenge for all of us who want to see some kind of moral foundations, not just for economics, but for society as a whole. No society can be held together without some form of fairness, justice, and some form of moral sentiments, right? And as Smith, pointed out, essentially this eternal union between the power of the money and the power of political power, right? So
yes.
when I think we'll get into this when you explain your strategic ideas about how to take your story forward as a program for activism campaigning against inequalities worldwide. But for now, you say inequalities is more important to tackle than poverty. How do you draw the separation, between essentially a widespread and widening poverty, and the last 1 year, the rich has recovered their losses. In fact, they are getting richer despite the pandemic, while hundreds of millions are going belly up every day because the pandemic has brought economies to a standstill.
Absolutely. I mean, Jeff Bezos, just as an individual, Jeff Bezos has $70 billion. Not Jeff Bezos has $70 billion. Jeff Bezos has $70 billion more than he used to have because of the pandemic. He's made $70 billion because of the pandemic. This is a guy who says that cities and countries should give him tax breaks for the privileges of having the offices there, that they should help pay for his helipads so that he can go visit. $70 billion richer. It's obscene. A friend of mine came up with this brilliant idea, which is that sometimes these numbers are also confusing. What if we invented a new currency, the nurse? And then we could talk about how many nurses, somebody had managed to accumulate, right? Because this is what they're doing. They're think of them as a vacuum cleaner, right? Sucking up rather than generating. You can't separate poverty and inequality. They both go together. But one of the dangerous trends that's been pursued, and it's been a failure in terms of tackling poverty, is this idea that it doesn't matter what happens at the top. It absolutely matters what happens at the top. And it doesn't only matter because resources shouldn't go there. They should be spread more fairly. There are two benefits when you redistribute from the rich to the poor. One of the benefits is to generate revenue. So, for example, we could have every child in preschool, every single one across the world. This isn't only in rich countries. Every child could be in free, taxpayer funded preschool. Every child could stay in school from preschool. I'm talking from say 3 or 4 all the way to 18. Every single one, right? There isn't a country where we couldn't do that. We could also have in every country child benefit and pensions and forms or other forms of income support processes for people, as well as completely free healthcare, right? We could have all of these things everywhere, all across the world, even in the lowest income countries, if we resource them through a fair taxation system. And a fair taxation system means, for example, one, not putting everything on VAT, which hits the poorest the hardest. 2, taxing income progressively, so at higher rates of income tax for the richest rather than the poorest. In Kenya, for example, a billionaire oligarch pays the same tax rate as a teacher. Right? There is no higher tax rate, and they just reduced the highest tax rate in the context of COVID. I mean, literally the most unnecessary policy intervention ever. And the third is that we need to tax wealth. Now, if we did that, we'd have the money for these things. But the redistributive benefit of removing money from the rich and giving it to the poor or spending it on public goods is not just that it generates revenue. It's also necessary. We have to break up concentrations of power. Some people are just too big that the social consequences of what they do are damaging. Amazon, for example, is too big. Microsoft is too big. These need to be broken up. And so there's also a key role that redistribution plays in bringing back democracy, fairness, opportunity into society as a whole. So it's partly about the money, but it's also about the way in which society is run. If we allow a concentration of wealth, we will have a concentration of power. Now, there was a brilliant Supreme Court justice in the States, Louis Brandeis, at the beginning of the 20th century. He said this: you may have the concentration of wealth, or you may have democracy. You can't have both.
Right. Yeah. Can I take you one step back? Because when you say, redistribute wealth from a few hands for the greater good, right? The horizontally. I think you stand accused of being a socialist or even communist, right? The minute you mentioned redistribute wealth, right, you are considered a threat to the established capitalist order, right?
Yeah.
Because, but I think, what is so galling here is that the rich have refashioned the state. When you say taxation, we are talking about the domains of the state, right? HM revenue services or internal revenue services in the US. You also mentioned like Ronald Reagan and neoliberal trickle-down economic policies. And then also, you also mentioned Thatcher, right? Thatcher and Reagan, they collaborated together in promulgating this form of false economic narrative, right? And we need to tax the rich less, because that will incentivize these brilliant entrepreneurial minds, and then that will create wealth, and everyone will be lifted, right? The level of wealth, the water rises, and then the poverty level drops, and then people, right? But in the last, let's say from the 1980s, when Reagan and Thatcher were in office in London and Washington, they have reshaped the state. Yeah, state is, as the pandemic last year and still shows that states are the most powerful organizations humans have ever created. You capture the state, and then you make the state to redistribute wealth upward, right? It is not that the free market had redistributed the wealth in accord with the brilliance of entrepreneurial class. It is the state that has facilitated this funneling of wealth upward to what we call 1%, right? And so redistribution has been happening in the last 40 plus years. That was what gave birth to the billionaire and now trillionaire class, right? And so how do we tackle this, the rich having captured the state, and then running these World Economic Forums at Davos, flying in on their private jets, right? And then like you bring in a few token progressive voices like Greta Thunberg and others, but they set the agenda, you know, this Davos clause. And how do we confront this, you know, the states being in the hands of or being beholden to this, you know, 1,000 billionaire and their affiliates?
That's a great question. I mean, when we look back at history, and this is what I did in this book, was to look back at history, because I didn't just want to guess my answer or, you know, what's a possible theory. I looked at two periods where inequality really had been reduced, and there's really only two in the past 150 years. The one is Latin America in this century, from about the year 2000 to about the year 2010, 12, 15, something like that, about a decade and a half at the beginning of this century, the 21st. The other big period, which is much longer and much more global, is across the world. It ends in around the 1970s. It was known as the Golden Age. It starts in different places. In some of the newly independent countries in Africa and Asia, it only starts in the 50s or 60s, depending on when they get freedom. In some parts of Central Europe, it only starts after World War II. But in Scandinavia, it starts in the 30s or 20s. In the US, it starts in the 30s with the New Deal. And in the UK, actually starts as far back as 1870. So that long mid-20th century period is one, and that's international. And the other one is this Latin America in the early 21st century. Now, what they both had in common, when I looked at how on earth did it happen, was this. It was never a market self-correction that fixed the inequality problem. It was never government just receiving some insight and wisdom from policy advisors and fixing it. It was never a rescuer president or a rescuer heroic politician who we sometimes look to. And it was instead the pressure of power from below. Now, this point about the rescuer president is really important, because sometimes we look for one. Sometimes people will say, oh, you know, this current crop of leaders, they're not like what Franklin D. Roosevelt was in 1930s at the US in the Great Depression. Now, FDR, who did brilliantly as a deliverer of justice, perhaps the best American president ever, alongside perhaps Lincoln. But you know, FDR was an aristocrat, and although he first came in with what was called a brains trust, a group of radical thinkers, their ideas didn't get through. They were blocked by the internal pressures of government and more powerful voices. You had very, very old school depression economics people in the Treasury who were holding him back. It was the pressure from below, from trade unions, from Black activist groups, from organized civil society groups, feminists and others. It was that pressure that put the frighteners on, that got the action. And so even when you have good leaders, you know, Lyndon B. Johnson famously says to Martin Luther King, look, I know what I have to do, but you have to make me do it. Even when you have good leaders, you need that pressure from below, which is why, and it's interesting you said, you know, nowadays, if you talk about redistribution, people will say you're a communist or whatever. That when you look back at the US, England, and France, and also Germany and Italy and others, in the 50s and 60s, late 40s, 50s, and 60s, people who are called Christian Democrat or Republican or Tory are administering policies like mass building of public housing, like raising the wages of the poorest, like constraining the wealth of the very riches and introducing fairer taxation systems. They're doing it, as well as people called social democrats or Labour or socialist or whatever. Both mainstream parties are doing it when in government. When you get to the 1980s or the 1990s, neither mainstream party is doing it. So, for example, if you take the economic policies of a 1990s Democrat, they are, if you like, to the right of a 1950s Republican. Why is this? We can't just look at this in terms of personality reasons. It's because in the earlier period, trade unions and people's organizations were strong, and in the later period, they were weak. And that's why the breakthrough in Latin America in this century, you cannot ascribe it to the individual heroism of a Lula, a great man though he is, but he himself emerged from a workers' movement that bonded with indigenous peoples' movements, with Afro-descendant movement, with landless peoples' movements. And those movements together, coming together in what the Reverend William Barber calls a fusion coalition, that's power. So if you want to make the state accountable, it isn't just, and you must never just get stuck on your guy winning. This heroism, this notion of hope in biography always lets us down, right? I mean, in Myanmar is the most absolutely tragic case where this idea that it would be the lady that would deliver us. I mean,
Right.
how tragic, but yet how predictable to watch. In South Africa, the ANC, who I love deeply and was part of and are kind of inscribed in my soul, and Nelson Mandela, who I love dearly. But when they came into government in South Africa, they told all of the allied forces that had worked with them, the trade unions, the social movements, the people's groups, don't cause us trouble. Government's hard. Now leave us alone. And come join government. You don't need to moan from the outside. Come in. Come be a minister. Have a car, have a house, have a budget. This is real power, not shouting in the streets. Stop shouting in the streets. Shouting in the streets is counter-revolutionary. It's against us. It's against progress. It was a really, really bad decision. And it led to a post-apartheid radical government with some great human beings in actually increasing inequality. And the first time you saw real social progress in South Africa was when you had defiant movements, the Treatment Action Campaign that said, we are going to, make this place ungovernable unless we get treatment. We're going to blockade roads. We're going to cause hell and high water. And then the students' movement, roads must fall and fees must fall. It was the disobedient movements that were successful. So the short answer is, it isn't just about capturing power at the center. It is good to have your man better rather than their man, or your woman rather than their woman. So it absolutely, for example, in the States, is good news and is meaningful that a fascist was thrown out of the White House. That matters. But those who either dreamily think that now, because Joe Biden, a kid from Scranton, Irish Catholic, with the first Black woman vice president, that's going to rescue them, or just feel anguished and disappointed. Oh, nothing can happen because those guys are not very radical. Both of those are wrong. The power, the most important power, is with us. And it's perfectly possible to secure radical changes with a not very glamorous president or prime minister in charge, if you as people are well organized. And likewise, you could have the most beautifully articulate president or prime minister in charge with good values. If you're not strongly organized as ordinary people, you will not get policies that shift power and wealth back to you. So the real answer is that. And what's so amazing is that in those periods too, when we are strong, then all this nonsense about, you're out there, you're a communist, your things are, it gets forgotten. Even the most establishment people start singing our tunes. They used to in the 50s, and they'll start singing them again. And whereas in the 80s and 90s, even our team wasn't singing our tune.
Right. Yeah, no, I am utterly in complete agreement with you on the, this messiahism, if you like, right? And what I meant to say is that, state was ideologically and intellectually captured by a certain paradigm. And that paradigm is what you called, or many of us call, neoliberals, right? And reshape the state, incentivize the rich, and the rest of us will also benefit. Yeah, but there was the American diplomat based in Jakarta some 30 years ago, who was in the economic affairs division of the U.S. Embassy. And then after his retirement, he told me in Bangkok, saying that, I was pushing for Reagan economics, right, trickle down in Southeast Asia, because the Americans are very powerful with the World Bank and other lending agencies and whatnot. He said trickle down. He said, forgive my language, it's like, a rich person having a fine wine or a fine beer and going to the urinal and urinating, and the rest of us would be drinking from that urinal. That is what trickle down means. Of course, this is a very crude and crass.
It's a great one. It's a great explanation. It's probably the best I've heard.
Metaphor.
It's great.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And then so I think the starting in the 1970s at the towards the end of the Vietnam War, Robert McNamara, the then the extremely brilliant and also he was the corporate executive from GM, I believe, and then became defense secretary, right? Mathematician, and after he resigned from the defense, or he was booted out of the Pentagon, he was made president of the World Bank. And there was a conference, international conference by World Bank held in Nairobi in 1973, when he put poverty on the international map of policies, right? Poverty, because poverty was then framed as a conducive material conditions for the spread of communism. So that was, poverty became a strategic antithesis of U.S. containment policies, right? And then you've got in the late 70s and early 70s, the Professor Johan Galton framed poverty as structural violence. Poverty is not a product or outcome of people being lazy or unintelligent or unwilling to work. It is structurally produced by certain economic systems or modes of systems, right? And now, 2021, we are still talking about this perennial question, the inequalities and vast sea of poverty, they are hand in glove, right? And so if we are to shift the orientation, not putting the Joe Biden in the office, or the Keir Starmer or Labour in number 10, we are talking about creating a policy narrative based on the facts that poverty or inequalities could not be understood simply in economic terms. And my old roommate, Sabina Elkia, developed this multidimensional poverty. Yeah, she and her colleague James Foster from George Washington University in Washington developed this multidimensional poverty measurement. Looking at deprivation along education, health, and the material conditions, whether the roof is leaking or whether your household has anyone who has gone beyond year 6 of primary grades, right? And so how do you see this push to confront inequalities going forward? Because you work with UN agencies, you were also in charge of ActionAid's the study on this issue. Given your intimate knowledge of these global international organizations, how is this discourse being received? Or have you experienced pushbacks? When you say it's not a few brilliant policy advisors making policies happen. It's the pressure from below, just us, but organized. And so, how do you see these two parallel trends? People like yourself in a strategic position, where you could articulate alternative policy analyses based on facts, and then like people like us or myself, like screaming from the street. How do you see these parallel trends having impact, if at all? Because the paradigm is still growth. You know what I mean?
Yes. So there's a paradox, and I wrote the book because I was experiencing this paradox. When I first was working on the issue of inequality, if I raised that these three things, inequality is rising, inequality is harmful, and we need the state to intervene to tackle it. When I would say these three things, then, you know, polite critics would call me a communist, and the less polite ones would want to put me or my friends away. Now you can't get through a World Bank report without seeing those three things on about page 1 or 2. Every single country has signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, which are really radical. They pledge, and this is goal number 10, that every government will reduce inequality within and between countries. That was never pledged in the first set of goals, the Millennium Development Goals that went from 2000 to 2015. But this second set that we're supposed to be in now, a third of the way through, pledges that. So if you tried to list out all the countries that have promised to reduce inequality, you'd run out of breath. But if you tried to count on your hand all the countries that are actually tackling inequality seriously right now, you'd have fingers to spare even if you only used one hand. So that paradox that we felt that we won the debate and yet so little had happened in practice kind of forced me to confront the reality that actually inequality isn't a policy debate, it's a power struggle. And so what I find now is that actually there's loads of space open for me to raise these kind of issues. You know, in the landmark Human Development Report, you know, the kind of UN's gift to the world, in the one last year, they asked me to write for it. You know, and that, I guess that's a kind of sign of the times. There are some really, really brilliant UN reports with some bold policy calls. It used to be that those type of reports, you know, they have to smuggle the radical parts into the footnotes of page 122, but now they're even in the titles. Now, this is really exciting, but history shows we cannot think that change flows just from that, just from having, you know, if you like, won the dinner party argument or the academic common room argument. This really is a power struggle. And so I'm much more energized by what people are doing in organizing. I'm really excited about the young people who are mobilizing for Black Lives Matter and who are saying that Black Lives Matter doesn't just mean that Black people are being killed by police, but also that Black people are being killed by the failure to provide justified equal healthcare, by the failure to provide justice in wages and a decent minimum wage, by the failure to support childcare and education. I'm really excited about the environmental movement and the people fighting not just to save the planet with a Green New Deal, but to save jobs and to make more jobs and to make real prosperity where we have quality public transport, great public housing, shared services. These are really exciting agendas. So it's those that give me hope, whether it's the women's movement, Black Lives Matter, the climate movement, the trade unionists who are organizing in sectors that some experts said you could never organize. Some people said you can only organize people who meet together in a factory. So you can't organize Uber drivers or Lyft drivers. It's happening. They're doing it and they're winning real victories. Now, the historical record seems to be that you need to start with organizing and you need to start with winning some small victories. You win those small victories, for example, getting a higher wage for your people or better rights for parents when they have babies so that they can take time off work, or saving a local health center that's being threatened with taking it away, or protecting a park, or winning on some issue, some concrete issue, but also recognizing that there's no one policy change that tackles inequality. And so when you as a group win some change, you need to do two things. One is win the change. Secondly, you need to emerge from that winning more confident, more together, more skilled, more reflective about how you do change number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I feel right now some great listening and welcome in the policy sphere, and that's wonderful. But the tragedy of it is it's, unless accompanied by a power shift, it's inconsequential. So then what energizes me much more is what's happening outside of that. It's the people who are causing what the former Representative John Lewis, who before he was a politician was a civil rights, very young civil rights leader with Martin Luther King. John Lewis talked about getting into good trouble. And the record of history shows that every successful movement has in tackling inequality, has three parts to it. First, be willing to get into what's called good trouble. There's no movement that at the beginning was welcomed by the establishment. The New York Times said that the suffragettes, who just wanted votes for women, were dangerous, problematic people. They even said it about the anti-slavers, right? Second, you have to build power together, because on your own, you're not powerful, but collectively you can be. And thirdly, you have to build a story, a moral conversation about the type of society that you want to create. Now, these three approaches have not always succeeded, because tackling inequality is extraordinarily hard. So the beautiful phrase that particularly they use in Latin America or in Spanish-speaking countries, people will say, the people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated. Now, sadly, it's not true. The people united are often defeated. But what is true is this: the people disunited are always defeated. And so though resistance doesn't always work, acceptance always doesn't work. And so these three things, be willing to get into trouble, build power together, and build a new story, though they're not guaranteed to work, indeed, they're guaranteed to often not work, there is not a method other than that I came across when I look back at 150 years of history as to how people can confront an unequal society and generate an equal one. They cannot wait for savior leaders. They have to build it from within. And when they build that power from within, it isn't just a one-off process of getting your guys in charge. It's a constant and difficult push that's always holding to account, has no unaccountable heroes, always pushing, always challenging. It's not a process that ends, sadly. We often want to get to the end of something. Sometimes NGOs say they want to do themselves out of business. Now that doesn't work. It's a never-ending kind of Manichaean struggle, but it has been won in the past and it can be won again. And our ancestors have bequeathed us a method that we know works. And so that's where I feel hope. So, I've worked in academia and policy, and that world is fun and interesting. And right now it's actually quite ripe for this type of conversation, but it's so much less important than it thinks it is. And the power world is what matters. And the people who are starting to challenge the power world are the ones who, often academics and policy people look down on, but frankly, they're the hope. They're the hope. It's not about the people writing, the best journal article. It's about the people struggling and testing and exploring new ways of organizing. Those are the people who are building the change we need.
Sticking with the thematic challenge here, the inequalities, right? I mean, this is not just an issue that interests or concerns, people who are activists, socially engaged, or engaged academics and scholars. But what's fascinating is, even some of the richest people are concerned about the extremity of inequalities. I was in the US for 17 years working and also studying. And in my days, some 20 plus years ago in the US, I remember Bill Gates Sr. And people like George Soros marching onto the Capitol, testifying before Senate Finance Committee. Basically, these are like, in those days, there was no such thing yet as a billionaire class. Yeah? A handful of very, very rich individuals telling the U.S. government, tax us more, because they were far-sighted, right? Okay, we had benefited so much from this system, and this system is rigged against little people, right? So we talk about, minimum wage, not living wage. I mean, you also pointed that out as well. I mean, like the living wage campaign has been around for as long as my memory serves me, right? Still, like the United States has it's still debating whether $15 per hour is affordable, right? I mean, like, so but basically what we are looking at is just not simply the billionaire class, but some of the wrong-headed, the policy types that got their priorities wrong. Surely, if a society can afford billions of dollars worth of nuclear warheads, whether like submarines in UK or like 20,000 nuclear warheads, they all cost like billions of dollars just for maintenance, dusting things and making sure that there are no leakage, right? And why is it that in a lot of places, socialized medicine is always considered too expensive, but F-16 fighters are affordable. You see what I mean? So this is this is happening within the state domain and within the public narrative, the stories, right? People who are likely to benefit want the socialized medicine, the majority, and the people who are in position to make those policies dismiss them year in and year out, right? So the World Food Organization won the Nobel Peace Prize, and many of us look at it as a mixed blessing. WFP deserves the recognition it has been conferred this year in January, this year. But at the same time, it is a scathing indictment of the conditions of the world. The organization dedicated to feeding the malnourished and the needy has to be recognized with the highest honor in the world. And then so despite all the organizings, and do you think the discourse of economic growth and the inequalities can, or the fight against inequalities can coexist in an intellectually and ideologically progressive fashion? Because on the one hand, the growth paradigm, the market-driven growth paradigm, has produced vast inequalities and brought us all on the brink of climate catastrophe. Can we stay within this paradigm to fight those challenges that threaten our survival?
Yeah, no, we can't. We can't stay within that paradigm. And I think increasingly people are recognizing that we can't. And that's what gives me hope. They want something more human. And we've had that in the past and we can have it again. So it is possible. The notion, they have a phrase, there's no alternative. There are alternatives, other things are available. And we just have to insist on the right choice being made. Now, you touched on two things that are optimistic in terms of some of this conversation, that some of these things that were very much at the margins are now approaching the mainstream conversation, which is really wonderful. You talked about two parts. One was, you said, and this is really exciting, I agree, there are some people, a slither amongst the privileged, who recognize this. And they are wonderful to have. They are unusual allies, and they help to articulate why actually a more equal society is in everyone's interest. There's a wonderful group that is just coming together called Millionaires for Humanity, which brings together, as it says on the tin, very wealthy people who actually argue the case that they should be taxed on their wealth. Largely, most countries of the world have zero tax on wealth. They feel they should be taxed on their wealth in order that they can help to build a fairer, more stable society. They're inspired by the example of the patriotic millionaires in the US, which is another group. And they're now with Millionaires for Humanity taking this globally. That's really exciting and meaningful. At the same time, we have to recognize, as Martin Luther King said, that change has never been brought only by appealing to the conscience of those in authority. And so, and I say this not to cast moral aspersions at those at the top. I actually think that in some ways we get too distracted trying to judge whether those at the top, whether at the top of money or the top of politics, are good or bad. These are, in a way, unhelpful frames for making the decision about whether we need to organize. Because if those people at the top are good, we still need to organize. So let's just organize. And so we know from history that we cannot expect a conscience reformation by the rich to transform this on its own, welcome though it is in some places. The second part that you talked about, which gives me the greatest hope, is you said it's not just activisty types. You know, this is becoming a narrative everybody cares about. In COVID, people have realized that the superheroes is not Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. The superheroes are nurses, delivery men, care workers, cleaners. These are the superheroes, the people that hold our society together, the people who we thought were throwaway, didn't deserve a minimum wage. Then we called them essential workers. We clap for them every week. And now they're saying, thanks for the applause. And also, can I feed my kids? Now, there's a growing movement that says, yes, you know, these are the people that we need to support. That's really exciting. We're seeing, for example, in the movements where people are organizing for better wages and conditions at work, people who've never organized before, you know, casual workers at McDonald's or at supermarkets who'd never organized before, who don't see themselves as political, but realize that now is the moment where they will get to have a wage that can feed their family and ensure that they have enough heat all year round, and also that they can look out for each other. They're seeing now that this is a moment. So we know that the greatest change is never achieved by a vanguard, by some ultra politicized kind of a super activist full-time elite. That's not how change happens. It happens through the masses. I went back, for example, and I looked at the Montgomery bus boycott. That's the story every kid learns in school about why it is that the horrible old laws that used to exist in the US that sent black people to the back of the bus, why they ended. We at school all learn it's because Rosa Parks sat down and Martin Luther King gave a speech. That's not the story. That's not the true story. The true story is so much more exciting than that. They planned for 2 years in advance. A group of African-American women planned for 2 years in advance. Rosa Parks wasn't tired. She was tired of injustice. That's why she refused to sit down. She trained, and she trained at a school that in fact learned from Scandinavian trade unionists, the Highland School that learned from Highland schools from Scandinavia. And they planned, and it took them a year afterwards, a year where they had the postmen helping them plan the routes, where every single black church every Sunday was a center of organizing, where the whole of Montgomery was winning this fight, where academics didn't just think, oh well, now that there's a struggle on, I must be the intellectual guru of this struggle. Academics did what, this was their biggest contribution to Montgomery bus boycott. They printed the posters, because you couldn't print anywhere at the time except in university. They were the only people that had printers, and they risked their jobs. Some of them lost their jobs printing at night, all these posters that kept this thing going. The whole of Montgomery did it together. So we know that when real change happens, when you get more equal societies, it's not because 10 activists, you know, have some creative placards. It's because 10 reach out to 10, reach out to 10, reach out to 10. Not people who would have thought of themselves as political, but people who just believe that everybody, you know, deserves to be treated as a decent human being and is not going to stick around whilst that's not being lived up to. And what's really exciting in this moment is that is happening. COVID is a moment of opportunity. The thing that I would caution people about COVID is that we've had crises before, perhaps not as extreme as COVID. COVID is perhaps the biggest economic crisis that we've had in 100 years, and perhaps the first one to hit every country in the world at the same time. I mean, even the Wall Street crash didn't hit the whole world, but we've had crises before. The 2008 crisis should have been the end of neoliberalism, but it was a big boon for fascism, and the neoliberals actually went into partnership with the fascists and stayed in authority. The 1970s oil crisis led to neoliberalism rather than away from it. The Wall Street crash in the US led to the most progressive government they've ever had, the FDR government, the New Deal administration. In Central Europe led to fascism. So this crisis, where will it lead? We don't know. You referred to the Reuters piece that I wrote where I summed up 2020, and then they asked me to sum up 2021. And I said, the thing about 2021 is it's not yet written. You know, I can't say what's going to happen because it really is in our hands. It could be that this crisis becomes a moment for migrant baiting, for nationalism, for people creating two classes, you know, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, or the work from homes and the worker bees. You know, there's so many dangers, but it also could be a moment of solidarity and collectivity. And it's up to us to push it in the right direction. And when I say us, I don't mean us by writing policy papers and articles, and us by organizing in our communities, making our communities strong and building relationships, building experience of the kind of society that we want to build. What's so exciting, I think, in this crisis is we're seeing what a yearning there is for such a society.
Yeah, can I push you a bit further with two questions? One is, you know, we organize, and when we organize, we aim to have an impact on certain institutions of power, right? And policy changes, narrative changes, right? What we've been talking about is basically the you know, this Smithian marriage of wealth and political power, right? They share the spoil, if you will, right? The rich keep the politicians in political offices, and politicians keep the economic status quo, right? And so any organizing is going to pose you know, greatest threat to this you know, power wealth nexus, or the establishment, if you will.
Yes.
Right? And but it's beyond putting this single individual or politician in office and then like making sure another crop of progressive come in. But it requires you know, similarly you know, similar shifts in the orientation of the state, you know, the governing body for society, right? You know, like going back to Thatcher's time, Thatcher said there's no such thing as society. It's only individuals, you know, being frugal and saving money, right? Like her own groceries family in Lincolnshire, right? And then so I think I would push you to take us into the domain of the state.
Yes.
What kind of things would you like the state, you know, to do?
Great.
Say, for instance, like taxation, social benefits.
And what's great is that when we look at the historical record of how countries reduced inequality, we kind of know what it is. I guess there's two things to bear in mind. The first is that there is no single policy that does this. So some people get very excited about an individual policy. I see at the moment, people get very excited about the basic income grant. Basic income grant is great. It's a great policy. Putting money into the hands of ordinary people is a great contributing way to help reduce inequality, but it will not do it on its own. And variations of that argument, the basic income argument, that say this is what we need to do, then we don't need public services, we don't need the state, we don't need wages, etc., are really dangerous. So the first thing is to caution people against the idea of any magic bullet, which is why when I talked about organizing, we can't just organize for one change, because one change will not reduce inequality, even if you're 100% successful, whichever policy you pick. The second thing, though, that's interesting is it's not really a mystery, because we've seen governments reduce inequality. So if we take, what did the Lula government in Brazil do? This was the most progressive government that Brazil has ever had, that they had in the early part of this century. And what's interesting is it's actually not that different in policy terms to what was done in Europe in the golden age, in the post-World War II and other era. So what did the Lula government do? they did put money in the hands of ordinary people. They called it the Bolsa Familia. That was giving money to everyone with children, right? Which is a large swathe of the population. And they also started to act on pensions. So that's the elder people as well. So that's akin in a way to the kind of handing people money, basic income grant aspect. You could build on that policy where you put money in the hands of every parent, you put money in the hands of every pensioner. You could also just put money in the hands of every human being as an individual. That's one quiver, if you like, one arrow to put in your quiver. A second one is around wages. You need to raise people's wages and their rights at work, their experience at work. And you do so partly through legislation that directly intervenes in the market. So you can pass minimum wage laws, parental leave laws, health and safety laws, and maximum hours laws, and others. And you do it partly by strengthening the institutional structure for trade unions. So you make it easier for people to join a trade union, harder for companies to block trade unions, and then those trade unions lift everyone's wages and everyone's benefits up too. So there's a piece around money in people's hands. There's a piece around wages and working conditions. There's a piece around public services. Actually, the redistributive benefit of getting things like free healthcare, free education, and free or subsidized water, et cetera, are actually higher than what people get in cash grants. At the moment, there's a kind of negative tax because or a negative a benefit that the poorest people are paying, because if they're paying for education and healthcare, that's a massively regressive tax. So if you make that free, not only do you strengthen their health and education, you've also taken away a spend that they were spending before. So that free social service is a key one. Another fascinating thing around free public services is it starts to build a more equal community. When all kids go to school together, or when people meet each other in the waiting room of a hospital, or when people take public transport together, that's the beginnings of community. Amartya Sen writes very beautifully about how when kids have free school meals together in India, it was a wonderful attack on the caste system because suddenly people were communing together. So it isn't just an impact at a substantive level, but it's also an impact at a symbolic or emotional, psychological level. So talked about money in the hands of people, talked about wages and rights at work, talked about public services. You need to tackle discrimination as well, because although all working people, all the 99% are oppressed, different people are oppressed in multiple ways. So you need to tackle discrimination against women, discrimination against people of color, and other forms of discrimination that people face. So there's an anti-discrimination aspect too. There's a land reform aspect that's very important, especially in countries that are more rural or where wealth has been more to do with land. There's taxation, really key. It's about taking away taxation on the poorest people. The poorest people pay the highest taxation on VAT, and especially VAT on essential goods like food and fuel, books, and things like that. So you want to take it away from that, and then you want to have taxes on wealth and have progressive taxes on income. And then there are issues, for example, around campaign finance reform, around monopolies, so that no company should ever get to be too big. So this is the kind of package. Now, this is the kind of package that Lula pursued, not substantively enough, actually. And one of the things that Lula failed to do was really to disempower the aristocrats, those people who often were descended from Portuguese or Spanish or Italian, who from centuries back, who continued to dominate the landed wealth, and they were the people who then organized a coup against them. There was, interestingly, much more radical land reform in Taiwan and South Korea after World War II, organized by American generals to get rid of the aristocracy, and got rid of them forever. So they were actually more radical, if you like, than Lula was then. But Lula had the elements of what you need, and the proof was that you saw huge reductions in poverty, but you also saw that where everyone grew, you saw much higher growth for black people versus white people, for women versus men, for landless versus landed, for rural versus, so you saw much higher growth for those who needed the most. So that's the package. But the interesting thing, I think, is not so much the package, because you could almost assign, you know, a policy writer or a consultant or an expert to work on that, and they could give you most of the answers in a week. That's not the most exciting thing. The most exciting thing is how you get there. Because why is it that when this package, which is so evidenced, right? It's this package that was the way that Lula reduced inequality in Brazil. But it's also, for example, how when Ghana took independence, the first African country to take independence from the West, and they did so, it was the trade unions played a really key part, and particularly the cocoa workers. So the cocoa workers have been very exploited, very underpaid. All the money from cocoa was going to foreigners and to the hands of a few. Then with the Cocoa Marketing Board, suddenly the wealth of cocoa was going to the whole country. The cocoa workers got higher wages for themselves, but then helped lift up wages and working conditions for all Ghanaians. The cocoa workers got free education, first for their kids, and then the Cocoa Marketing Board was making so much money that it was even able to fund free education for every child in a poor African country right at the beginning of independent rule. So this method of finding the policy interventions to tackle inequality is known. But what we also know when we look back at all these different examples is how it got there. It wasn't just because one leader decided to. It was because the institutional power of ordinary people was strong enough. And in particular, they organized and then they grouped together those organizations. So you had, you know, Brazil is a wonderful example of this. Brazil had, and this is what from where the Lula government emerged and from where it was held to account, strong women's movement, strong indigenous peoples movement, strong Afro-descendant Black movement, strong urban working class trade union movement, and a strong landless workers movement, and a strong small farmers movement. All of these worked together, worked as one. And if we are to be successful in tackling inequality, we'll push for that policy mix together. And when I say together, I mean in two senses. We'll push for the mix together, and we'll push together. If we don't push together, we're not strong enough as individual segments in order to be able to enforce any of that policy mix.
Right. So my final question is, you know, the pandemic has essentially given us both the very painful personal experiences, societal and global experience. At the same time, it actually presents us with the real intellectual, ideological, and social opportunity to see that in crises of this magnitude, only public institutions, that is to say, governments/states, are in a position to protect and advance human well-being, not the market, not the invisible hands, right? So everything is done by the visible hand of public institutions. So in the fight against inequalities, do you see the role of the state vis-a-vis the generosity of the philanthropist as something that needs to be revived? For so long, the last 40 years, the Rockefellers and the Gates and the Soros, right? And as generous as they may be, but they have essentially helped dismantle the welfarist foundations of this political organization we call states and governments, and then they present themselves as individual, essentially, messiahs.
So the facts of history, and this is why I went back to look at it. The facts of history is that every single time inequality was reduced in a transformative way in any country, every single time, the state. There is no society has done it Pick any continent and pick the last 150 years. No society has made a transformative shift, reducing inequality of wealth and power between people, reducing the power of the top 1%, increasing social equity. No country has done that without it being through the role of the state. So the state is absolutely key. So there's a lovely, you know, as we say in English, the state we're in. The state we're in really is about the state that we are in. And so it absolutely needs to be done through the state. So I hope, yes, that kind of what anarcho-capitalist or kind of libertarian hippie place has gone, and people realize that we need the state. There's a wonderful joke, you know, people say that as the plane starts to sink, you know, if you're on an airplane and the plane suddenly loses altitude, right? You suddenly, you know, when the plane was up here, there were loads of atheists. And when the plane starts to drop, there's very few atheists. The same is true in an economic crisis. You know, things are going like this. There's many libertarians, many people who think you don't need the state. Suddenly the things start to fall. Everyone's a Keynesian, right? So that's true. And that's optimistic. But the state is a tool. It is a mechanism. The state will not intrinsically do progressive things. So you can have a large and powerful state doing horrendous and inequitable things. It's a myth, in fact, that neoliberals shrank the state. They shrank the helpful part of the state. They shrank the nurses and grew the militias. Right? There was no small state under Pinochet. Right? And if you look at what happened in the US with prison numbers went through the roof. You know, so it's a myth that the state becomes small under neoliberals. It just becomes cruel and punitive.
I mean, I mean, what they did is, you know, precisely, they made the state work for them.
Exactly, and we have to make it
work for the
absolutely.
society.
So the state is
there's
there.
a radical
Yes.
reorientation that needs
Yes.
to be pushed, right?
Yes,
From below.
and then all the while that they were doing that, the trick, you know, it's like the magician. You know, he makes you look at one thing whilst he's doing another thing. So what they were doing was they were making the state work for themselves. In order to distract you from that, they were pretending that they were dismantling the oppressive character of the state. So now people realize that state is what you need in a pandemic. State is what you need in an unprecedented social and economic crisis. That if we get through this, we'll do so through the state. So I hope it's reached in people a renewed respect for the transformative power of the state. But what we must never have is too high a respect for the majesty of those who administer the state, right? So we need the state, but the state as a servant state working for us. They're not the boss of us. We're the boss of them. And so we need, on the one hand, this, you know, a recognition of the awesome power of what the state is capable of doing. But on the other hand, absolutely no deference whatsoever to those who are in charge of it. And even when, I'm sure we will, even when we start to get some better human beings in presidential palaces, we have to continue to make their life a little bit difficult. And in fact, if they are to have the chance that when they're old, I hope good leaders should not die in office, but should retire and have a chance to grow old tending a garden. But if we are to give those who might come to office a chance that when they retire, they don't need guards, you know, around them because we are not fuming at them, and that they can look back at their time with pride and not with shame, then actually, whilst they're in power, it is actually in their interests that we continue to make good trouble. So if there's one thing that I'd want people to take away from this, it's that it is possible for us, especially in this moment of flux, this moment of change, it is possible for us to change the trajectory and to make a more equal society. Been done in the past, we can do it again. But it ultimately will depend on us. And it won't be over when the good guys get into office. That's just one stage, one phase in a struggle that needs us. So as you said, there is no justice, there's just us. But that shouldn't lead us to despair, that should lead us to great hope, not in a hope that's above us, but in a hope that's around us. So we and our friends and our families and our neighborhoods, we're the people who we've been waiting for all this time. That's what the record of history shows, and that, I think, is what is starting to happen again, which leads me to a cautious optimism. I'm not saying we will fix it, but I am saying we can.
Well, Ben, you speak like a very engaged revolutionary here. The message that we, the people from below, can and do make a history and change, right? So we are not looking for political handout or living off generosity of those, with riches and immense political power. So that is a wonderful, optimistic, or if not optimistic, a hopeful note to end for any type of the discussion. And Ben's book, How to Fight Inequalities, is available in e-format, hardcover, as well as paperback from Polity Press. And I definitely urge anyone listening to grab a book from the nearest bookshop. And I'm sure we will have more conversations with Ben, because there's so many things that we have left untouched, like, tax havens and how this siphoning takes place. And there's so much, and these and also inequalities have been mobilized to basically turn society into far right, the neo-fascist and fascist places. Well, we just witnessed what happened in the U.S., and we also are living through the impact of Brexit now. Pandemic has overshadowed all the things, but soon we're going to feel the economic pain arising out of this great unequal social conditions, called Brexit. And thank you so much, Ben. Any final parting thought before I close this?
Thanks so much for having me. And I feel really excited about the kinds of stories that you've shared and the kind of activism that you're part of and that people that you know are part of. So it was just a real joy to be with you in this conversation. And I'm always happy to come back, and it's been a wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed this time with you. I hope it's been useful, interesting for our audience, and take care and thanks. And like I said, I think we might win this one.
Yes, we have to. We have no other choice. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ben.
Take
Have
care.
a good evening in
Thank you.
Rome. Yeah.
Thank
bye.
you. Take care. Ciao.